The Honourable David Cunliffe.
I should have done this prior to my colleague's very eloquent speech after the architect of the budget, Mr Gilmore, had spoken about. But I seek leave, Mr Speaker.
Order. The member knows when you take a point of order, it's to be succinct and to the point. It's not to have a preamble and a speech and offer congratulations and so on. If the member's got a point of order, raise a standing order and say what it is.
Seek leave to table the statistics on growth expectations resulting from the budget.
I'm not going to accept that. It's a published document. It's on the table of the House. It's all been given to everybody else.
Mr Speaker, the actual graph is not a published document. The graph it's not? The graph is not, Mr Speaker.
New material? Okay.
New material.
Leave aside for that purpose. Is there any objection? There is objection. I call Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I stand to speak on the third reading of the government's tax bill. Mr Speaker, this is actually a bit of a sad day for our country. The reason it's a sad day is that there is, in our country, a dream of equality. There is a dream of egalitarianism which runs as a thick current right through our history. That goes back to our most famous and our best Prime Minister, Michael Joseph Savage, who was a champion of egalitarianism. He was someone who dedicated his government to making New Zealand a better place for everyone. The idea of egalitarianism, the idea at the centre of it, is that people are judged by their moral character rather than by how much is in their wallet or how much was in their father's wallet. The tragedy of this budget is it turns us back to a day when a person is judged by how much money is in their wallet rather than the nature of their character. Mr Speaker, one of the revealing facts, I think, during this debate that came out very clear was the Prime Minister's comments about envy. The Prime Minister said he didn't think that average or ordinary New Zealanders should envy. Middle income earners shouldn't envy those at the top. What this revealed about the Prime Minister's character and the Prime Minister's view of the world was that the Prime Minister thinks that we should judge people by how much money they have. What it was revealed about the Prime Minister and the National Party's view, I think, about the world is that people should be judged by how much money they have. And in this budget, what they're doing is turning their back on decades and decades of egalitarian tradition in our country. For many years, the trade union movement, the Labor Party in earlier days, with a rather unpleasant middle period during the Roger Douglas period, for many years we have had a tradition of fighting for egalitarianism and making our country more egalitarian. And yet what this budget does is it turns its back on that tradition. And for me, that is a sad day in our country, that we would turn our back on one of the central traditions that is part of our identity, which is a commitment to egalitarianism. The commitment to the idea that a person should not be judged by the size of their wallet, but by the moral character, by the nature of their character. A person shouldn't be judged by which private school they went to, but by what kind of a person they are. And that is one of the central themes in our history. It is one of the central themes in our identity. And with this budget, we turn our back on that tradition by making our tax system far more regressive than it currently is, by flattening the income tax rate to make it much flatter, by adding to GST, which is by its nature a regressive tax. We send our country down a different path than the one we were travelling before. We send our country down a path in which there will be more haves, because there will be some people that get richer, but there will be an awful lot more have-nots. Because this tax system, the impact of the tax system will be to increase inequality in our country. It's also important, I think, to remember what is the history of inequality in our country. Up until the fourth Labor government, we had a relatively egalitarian structure. Then during the period of the fourth Labor government and then the Bolger years, inequality increased dramatically in our country. During the last Labor government, inequality relatively flatlined. The only significant difference was made by working for families, where there was some reduction in inequality. But we've still ended up in the situation where we have a dramatically unequal society, and this budget will only make it worse. Mr Speaker, the other part of this budget, which is perhaps surprising coming from a national party that prides itself on its fiscal probity, is that this budget actually borrows for tax cuts. There's an extra $660 million in borrowing this year, this financial year coming up in this budget, in order to pay for tax cuts. That means we're going to have to borrow an extra $660 million, about $1 billion over 4 years, in order to pay for these tax cuts, in order to pay for motorways that make us more dependent on oil, in order to pay for climate change subsidies, climate pollution subsidies. It seems to me absolutely irresponsible of a government, when it is already borrowing heavily, to borrow further for tax cuts which mostly go to the wealthy, for motorways that increase our dependence on oil, and for climate change subsidies. Mr Speaker, the other deficit, as part of the triple deficit of this budget, the fiscal deficit, the social deficit, the third deficit is the environmental deficit. Part of this, of course, is the subsidies to greenhouse gases. Part of it is the increased subsidy to irrigation schemes. We live in a country now where some of our groundwater is so polluted it is dangerous for babies to drink because it causes blue babies down in Canterbury. And it is a subsidy to further destruction of biodiversity. New Zealand is in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. We are losing native vegetation at the fastest rate since European colonisation. This budget has more subsidies to irrigation schemes that will drive that further. It also lacks a capital gains tax, which could put some downward pressure on the escalation in rural land prices, which is driving a lot of the biodiversity loss. So it has a triple deficit at its heart, a fiscal, social and environmental deficit. Mr Speaker, another aspect of this budget which I think is quite worrying is that we know that the government has said very clearly, the National Party has said very clearly, that in this term they will not privatise. And within limits, ACC might be a debate, but within limits they've relatively kept to that promise to some degree. The question will be, in the next term, it's clear that the National Party want to privatise. It's in their genes, so to speak. And it's clear that they will use the public debt as the rationale for more privatisation. So by adding to public debt, by driving out public debt further than it would have been as a result to pay for these tax cuts, they are creating the justification that they will use at the next election campaign for the privatisation debate. Because there will be a privatisation debate at the next election campaign, because National have made it clear that they plan to put privatisation on the agenda at the next election. And they will use public debt as the justification for privatisation. Mark my words. Mr Speaker, the rationale for tax cuts in this bill before us, I think, needs to be challenged. It's been given on the basis that it would reduce tax avoidance. Of course, the other way to reduce tax avoidance was to close the loopholes. What this budget does is it rewards tax avoidance. So that argument is a specious argument. It also makes an argument we had to have tax cuts for migration reasons, that is to reduce outward migration. We know that that's false from previous times. In 1986, when we had big tax cuts, we got a big outward migration leaving New Zealand, and then when taxes increased in 2000, after that period we had a lot of people coming into our country. So the migration argument doesn't hold. In terms of GDP growth, the argument doesn't hold either, because there's an awful lot of evidence just from New Zealand experience that there is not much of a close relationship between the top rate of income tax and GDP growth. So that argument doesn't really hold either. I think, Mr Speaker, one of the things that's interesting, and there was the surprise, of course, was the company tax rate cut. There's two things I think that are worth talking about in terms of the company tax rate cut. The first of which is that when the whole new right embrace of globalisation was adopted by Labor and National, the Green Party, amongst others, said the problem is that you will create a race to the bottom. You'll create a race to the bottom in terms of standards and taxes. Now, the arguments around cutting the company tax rate have proven how right the Green Party was about the race to the bottom. We are now in a race to the bottom on tax rates, and company tax is part of that. The other part of dropping the company tax rate, of course, is that we've now opened a 5% gap between the company rate and the top personal rate. Now remember, part of the rationale for why we had to cut the top personal rate from 38 to 33 was the 5% gap between the top personal rate and the trustee rate. There was also the companies were also being used to minimise tax. We've now opened